Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for including me in your deliberations over this day. It's my 4th trip to South Korea, and I always say yes when I'm invited because I know that it will be well implemented. It will be very well organized, and my role will be very clear, and I will be able to do my thing. But I want to start by thanking not only the people that have invited me, but all the people behind the scenes who did a lot of the work, who bought my plane ticket, who showed up for work on the airplane that got me here safely, that provided all the meals on the plane, that drove the taxi that took me from the airport to the hotel. There's probably 10,000 people that made it possible for me to stand before you today, including my family back home. My house might not be safe if it wasn't someone there to look after it. There's just so many different things in our interconnected world that make it possible for all of us to do what we do. And I think part of what it means to be in public service, whether it's in a national service or an international service, is being deeply aware and deeply appreciative of just how extraordinary these implementation systems are that we are privileged to enjoy, that others before us have helped to create, that it falls to us now to manage and to be stewards of these particular systems, and now to try and build them out around the world. I work for the World Bank, so I'm going to talk to you this morning about my particular work on that issue in different countries around the world. In the discussion afterwards, we will talk a little bit about how some of these ideas apply here in Korea. But I want to sort of try and connect sort of a big picture sense of how I and my colleagues have been addressing these kinds of issues, and then look at some very concrete ways of trying to respond to these challenges. And doing so by trying to provide you with some practical examples of how these play out. So this particular book that I will be drawing on, or giving you a brief summary of, called Building State Capability, as the title suggests, is really about trying to figure out some different ways in which we might respond to this broad imperative around the world to enable the public sector to do what it is supposed to do. And as I will show you this in some of the evidence shortly, there's just a very big gap in what needs to be done. And these kinds of conferences, I hope, are part of the process by which a global social movement amongst those who work in the public sector will start to convene around not only making their own jobs be appreciated, because so much of what they do is underappreciated, but also to convene in ways that enable new ways of thinking about and responding to these challenges to emerge. So a brief overview of what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off talking about why effective governance matters. That might seem self-evident, but I think it's important to have a good foundation for why we think about these issues in the way we do. I'm then going to talk about some of the particular aspects of what effective governance requires, but with a particular focus on implementation issues, since there's a whole bunch of stuff that obviously matters for making a government do what it's supposed to do. I'll then look at sort of, at least in the development world, how we tend to think about these problems and how we tend to respond to them. And I'm going to just provide a quick critique of all of that, then provide you with an alternative to that, and stress in that articulation the role that networks can play in that, and also, as has been touched on already, what role new forms of technology can play. I'm going to be very upbeat on this, on stressing the importance of cross-sectoral partnerships. That's already been stressed by Geert in his remarks. But I also want to be, I guess, appropriately sanguine, appropriately restrained in thinking about the role of new technologies. Because I think fundamentally, over thousands of years of human history of trying to run this thing called the public sector, the binding constraint, the thing that really has always stopped it working, is humans. It's not the new technologies are wonderful to the extent they enable things to be done more efficiently, perhaps at greater scale. But the thing that always undoes all of these systems is us. We are the problem, but hopefully we are also the solution. And so in trying to recognize the great importance and the opportunities that are created by modern technologies, I think any system is only as strong as its weakest link. Any chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And pretty much everywhere, in anything you look at, it's the people that become both the weak link, but also the great resource for trying to find better ways of doing things. And to the extent then that these new technologies can be deployed, they should be done so as part of and not as a complement to and not a substitute for thinking and acting around these questions in more innovative ways. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. I think it's important that we stress right from the get-go that the reason we care about government, at least from a development point of view, is that it's sort of part of, an intrinsic and necessary part of, a fourfold transformation that happens as a country goes from being mostly poor to a country that starts to become mostly not poor. And of course, standing here in Korea, many of you have lived that experience over the course of your lifetime, that you have viscerally experienced it in ways that most other people haven't. Exactly what those transformations feels like in the economy, the expansion and the raising of industrial and agricultural productivity, changing the whole basis on which society is configured, changing the ways in which political leadership is determined and how it is held to account, but also how administrative systems are created to do prosaic, kind of boring things like delivering the mail, to super difficult and challenging tasks like restraining powerful corporations, holding elites to account, being able to oversee the transfer of power. All of these things happen because an effective public sector does the difficult, unglamorous, but very necessary work of being able to constrain power, of being able to provide and uphold accountability mechanisms, and to be able to ensure that, indeed, the benefits of welfare provision, the benefits of legal rights, the benefits of property rights, all of these things then in principle become available to all. And so we care about governance from a development point of view because it's kind of again, the binding constraint. It becomes the weak link in the chain of trying to reform all of these things. And we need to think about governance, I think, in those terms. But to get there, of course, lots of things have to happen. And if you are reading about this in a textbook, you'll see chapters on the importance of leadership, of securing political support, having adequate public finance to be able to pay for all the bills that are associated with this, ensuring that there are appropriate countervailing mechanisms to hold these different parts of the system accountable and to provide necessary pushback, and to ensure that all of this is done through a professionalized and increasingly professionalized public service where merit-based recruitment for hiring and promotion is undertaken. Those are all quite recent innovations, really, in the history of the public service. In the last 30 or 40 or 50 years or so, has that been made the normal way in which things happen. It usually was just a shameless instrument of patronage and of using it to reward one's friends and punish one's enemies. But the professionalization of the civil service is all about helping it to become embedded but autonomous, to being able to be part of a society but separate enough that it is not captured by it. And those are very difficult trade-offs to be able to manage. So all of those things really important, and there's plenty of it's been said on all of that. I want to focus on this question of implementation capability, which is to say, can the designated agency tasked with doing the job asked of it, when policies are announced by a government and it wants to raise the quality of education or to improve the standard of public health or to build more roads or to improve the rate at which the roads are fixed, all those kind of tasks require an administrative system to show up and do its job every day. And that particular aspect, I think, we have much less theory on, much less empirical research on, but often a very disappointing set of responses to trying to respond to it. And I want to try and use my time here just to go briefly through some of these particular issues. One of my themes, I hope you will see, is that we need to be focusing much more on the role that teams rather than individuals play. And by then teams, I'm implying networks and broader groupings of associations, indeed even social movements that become part of the process by which ideas are shared, ideas are refined, ideas are scaled. And I think that's a crucial distinction with regards to how we then think about human resource policy in governments all around the world. As much as we are hired as individuals, we're ultimately hired to be players on a team. And that team itself then needs to be connected to other teams. And those are very different kinds of temperaments and skills that one needs to be able to move beyond just one's own personal skills, one's personal training, one's particular sensibilities, to being able to figure out how do you actually connect what you know to what other people know, so that the sum, as they say, becomes greater than the whole becomes greater than the sum of the parts. So let me just give you an example of what effective governance looks like in the health space. And one of the characteristics of governments struggling or figuring out over time how to do that is that there's just enormous variation in the way in which they are able to do this. The tasks that we ask of governments now, as embodied in the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that Garrett mentioned before, are just extraordinary in terms of what the world claims it's going to try and achieve by 2030, in 10 years' time. We're going to be providing education for all. We're going to be providing peace and inclusive institutions for all, lifelong learning for all. These are extraordinarily ambitious goals, but I think the essence of doing so much of this work is that it's in fact very, very difficult. It's hard to do all those things. And I'm just going to use one simple graph just to look at some of these bigger differences. This is a graph on the vertical axis that looks at what's called disability adjusted life years. It's sort of one measure of the effectiveness of a health system to ensure that people are able to work, are able to perform their jobs, are able to do things that are not, in fact, being able to contribute because they're injured or they're unhealthy or in other ways debilitated. So here, the lower number is a good number. But you'll see that there are two different lines here. One is a blue line and one is a red line. The blue line is for what are called non-communicable diseases. These are diseases that happen as a function of injury or as a result of internal problems with different organs or inside your body, like cancer or breaking a leg, right? Those are non-communicable. They happen to you, they happen to you. The really interesting one from a social point of view, and from this human issue, the people issue component that I've stressed, is that it's just much harder to deal with these non-communicable diseases. There's the ones that are transferred and spread through people, like HIV, like Ebola. All of these diseases, which are increasingly now part of the global public health discourse, are even more challenging than all the other kinds of health problems because humans are the means by which they spread. And trying to respond to these problems isn't just about having a doctor intervene with a particular individual to provide the appropriate curative care. It's about responding to a whole community, about being able to manage a whole set of disease vectors in and through which these particular conditions then spread. And the point of this graph is roughly to show that when you get to about $10,000 GDP per capita, okay, so a middle income country, more or less, there's not much difference really between whether you're in the communicative or the non-communicative space. Most of the countries in the world, whether they're rich or about 10,000, right, and over, more or less perform the same. All the big differences are in this red line, right? Up until you get 10,000, you have countries like the Central African Republic at the top, where it's a very, very, very poor country, but where enormous amounts of years are just being lost and lost and lost because of the inability of those systems to be able to respond effectively to people. Whereas a country like Nicaragua, you're seeing down the very bottom there, is not that much richer. It's still a really poor country, and yet it's achieving levels of effectiveness in its healthcare system that rival those of some much richer countries, right? So this idea of trying to look at and explain the enormous variation in the ways in which different systems are able to deliver, not just internationally here, but I'll have some graphs shortly that look at this within a country. It's just, I think, an empirical matter that the more complex a task is, the more variation you're going to see. And the task of being able to build out a public administrative system that's really effective is, in some sense, trying to reduce that variation because you get better at doing it, and because you get better at doing it for everyone, not just the rich who can buy the more effective healthcare or send their kids to better schools. Right? So this is enormous variation And I think I haven't got time. I could take you through dozens of different slides of showing this kind of variation everywhere. In education, you see this again elsewhere as well, where we now have, thanks to the OECD and others, a large body of data that helps us to be able to look at what kids actually learn in school as opposed to whether they just show up for school every day, right? The Millennium Development Goals were all about attending school. The Sustainable Development Goals are about learning at school. And that's an entirely different administrative task. It's not that hard, actually, to get kids to show up for school. It's really, really hard to get kids to learn. All right? Every single person in this room is a product of roughly about 15,000 hours of education. That's how long it took to produce you and me. That's a heck of a lot of hours by a lot of teachers when we were all snotty-nosed little teenagers that showed up for work every day to help us learn how to count, how to do calculus, how to learn science and chemistry and physics and all those kind of things. Right? It's a long, long process. And there's just enormous variation in terms of how different countries around the world can deliver that. That graph on the right there shows you the variation between 20% and 80% with regards to what percentage of students that have finished primary school in those 10 different countries, the extent to which they achieve on some pretty basic kinds of tests. So the policy is all very clear. You should go to school until you're age at least 12. But the variation in how those kids then learn once they are there, that's the much more complicated task that rightly we are now talking about in the 21st century, but it only gets more and more complicated because once you get kids through primary school, then you've got to get them through high school. Once you get them through high school, then you've got to get them into some form of vocational or higher education. And that again just requires a whole new administrative system in order to be able to do that and do it effectively. This graph on the left, just a very sobering account of just the fact showing there that in Indonesia, at least, or in Jakarta, the kinds of test performances that happen at the high end of the education distribution, the children that graduate from tertiary institutions in Jakarta are performing at the same level as the bottom students, the dropouts essentially of high schools in Denmark. Right? So the bottom end of one is performing at the same as the high end of another. And so those big, big gaps are just pervasive wherever you look. And if we're going to be meeting these big public sector challenges, we have to be thinking about these in very different kinds of ways. I mentioned that you could look at this variation not just between countries, you can look at them within them. This is just looking at even basic types of tasks, like whether people show up for work every day. So this is health clinic data from Morocco on the left and Yemen on the right. And again, this sort of 80-20 kind of rule that wherever you look, you see in some cases health clinics where it's normal to show up for work, everybody does their job, but under identical policies, under identical training systems, under identical pay scales, elsewhere in that same country, people will just routinely not show up for work and there will be no consequences for that, right? So why is that? Those are interesting applied research questions that we need to have a better handle on and try to learn from more of those situations where things are working and where things are not. And oftentimes the reasons for why things are working are not obvious. You have to do the kind of research that involves a lot of field work to be able to actually unpack what combinations of factors at this particular time, in this particular place, in response to this particular problem, enabled a much better solution to be identified and achieved. So in this big report we did a few years ago on service delivery in the Middle East and North Africa, we just produced a whole bunch of these kind of tables just showing that this variation everywhere. Let's try and learn from that though, rather than sort of punish the people that are doing bad or lament that, which is, I guess, partly necessary. The more optimistic story, the more positive story, is to recognize that under these very difficult kinds of circumstances, in Palestine under war type situations, we found schools where children are learning and performing at the same level as their OECD counterparts. That in a situation where 80% of these children's fathers are dead or in jail, where they live with the constant specter of war. And yet in that particular school, something magic is going on. The same teachers trained in the same places, using the same textbooks, being paid the same amount as everybody else, can put all those different ingredients together in a much more effective way than their counterparts elsewhere. And trying to learn more about the conditions under which those successes occur, I think is very important. If one takes a step back and just looks at the extent to which governments around the world are getting better or worse at being able to do their core functions, this very infamous table that we produced in chapter 1 of our book pretty much shows that only those countries that I've circled there, it's a very small number, only about 10% of the world's population that is currently alive now will have grandchildren that live in a country that is performing as well as those countries at the bottom end of the OECD. If you look at the governance data and indicators that we have that have now been collected for roughly 30 years around the world, and you just look at the extent to which improvement or not has occurred over that period, you can do some basic calculations then to figure out, well, how long is it going to take till they get to be as good as Greece or Portugal, countries at the bottom end of the OECD, not Korea or Singapore or Denmark, like the bottom end of the OECD. How long is that journey going to be? And how long and maybe difficult is it going to be? And for some countries, as you can see in those numbers in brackets there in the green column, we're talking thousands of years for some countries. So this is a very sobering kind of account that our expectations keep ratcheting up. We, the international agencies, help spread and articulate these very ambitious goals, and yet the ability of countries to respond to those seems to be stagnant or declining. So when you look at a country like India here, one of my favorite little pictures on the right-hand side there, this is a scene from Bihar with parents literally climbing the walls of a building in which their children are doing a test and smuggling the answers into them. And the graph on the left says that successive cohorts are doing worse than the ones before them. So it's not like India's got more and more people being born every year. The schools are having to take more and more students every year, and yet the standards being achieved by those students seem to be declining. I'm told the most recent data is a happier story, that decline has been at least stopped. But still, the point is that the scale of the challenges that are occurring in implementation across Africa in particular, where most of the world's poor will soon reside, the implementation challenges around just providing rudimentary services to those people is just enormous, and we have to do a much better job than we've been doing on that. When we talk about these kind of issues, certainly at the World Bank, but in other donor agencies, we tend to talk about this as a capacity building problem or about the need for institutional reform. That's the language we tend to use. And then there are 4 standard ways in which we tend to respond. The package of assistance offered to countries that are worried about their lack of capacity, largely about providing some form of technical advice from foreign experts, upgrading the technology they have. You can spend lots and lots of money doing that, looking very impressive, but not actually achieving very much. Putting people through lots of training courses so they know how to use all this new technology, and then transferring various different kinds of best practices from one country to another, in the name of arguing, well, we already know how to do this. It's been verified, it's been proved to be effective, it works, we should do it, or you should do it. And our administrative systems are largely set up to do that kind of work. It's not hard to procure a contract for a foreign advisor to come to your country and tell you what to do. We can hire all sorts of consultants to design a new software program to run your public financial management, or software in schools for entertaining ways of helping kids learn. We can hold lots of training programs in lots of nice hotels and give people certificates and everybody's happy. We can find and feel useful about sharing these things we call best practices, because that makes us feel like real professionals when we can show that we know that something for sure works. At least we think it does. All right, so that standard sort of way is part of what we show in our book has its place. There are certain kinds of problems in the world for which that's the right way to think about these things, but there's just an awful lot of problems, as I stressed at the beginning, where people become the issue, where the teachers become the issue around making the actual classroom learning happen, that can't be fast-tracked, that can't be solved by fancier technology, that can't just be fixed by hiring some foreign expert to come and tell you how to do it, or by traveling perhaps even to here or to Finland or all the other countries that do so well on these international tests and saying, well, those guys can do it, you should do what they do. Right? I think much more focus should be on looking at the process, the mechanisms, the spaces that were created wherein these effective systems themselves were nurtured, or incubated, and then scaled. That kind of understanding is much better than just looking at what comes out the end of those particular systems. So when you do this kind of standard fourfold approach, when you just worry about the experts and the training and the transferring of best practices, you get lots in the justice space. You get lots of nice new courthouses, like that picture there. That's in a country in the Pacific Islands that was worried about its justice, and so the Chief Justice decided he would like to turn up to work every day in a fancy new courthouse, so we spent millions of dollars providing him with a nice new courthouse, except it only gets used twice a year. You spend lots of money on a system that doesn't actually respond to the problems that actual people have, and that kind of response is quite pervasive in development, but it's also not particularly controversial. It looks nice to build that. What's wrong with that? It's eco-friendly. We've hired local workers to build it. All the tools and stone and woodwork was all locally sourced. You can tick all sorts of boxes to make it sound like this was the most eco-friendly, job-creating, efficiently built thing in the world, except it doesn't actually do what it's supposed to do. It doesn't actually respond to the types of justice problems that most people in this country face most of the time. And it's that kind of issue that we have to be much more creative in thinking about. I won't go through each of those other things, but there are different sort of categories of problems that then emerge and that enable these kinds of systems to perpetuate for decades at a time without raising too many alarm bells. So if we're going to do this in a different kind of way, I think that this brings us now back to the importance of focusing on teams rather than individuals, and on thinking in terms of networks and associations rather than just feeding information up a food chain so that some senior leader can announce a new policy prescription. Most of the work that we've been doing in response to this kind of critique is much more centered on working with particular units of government in particular countries who want to engage with the particular task that is mandated to them, but do that in a very different kind of way, to do it in a way that doesn't just copy what other people do, but that tries to create their own sense of what their problems are, to diagnose those particular problems in their own way, and to then create a space wherein they can try and find locally designed and locally implemented solutions to those problems, not one that comes in from the outside. It takes a long time, it's not easy, there's no quick fix, just as there isn't any quick fix for learning a foreign language or for playing the cello. You've got to practice these things until you get much better. And working in administrative life is kind of like that. We take it for granted, those of us who are part of these big organizations, because it's all we've known or it's what we've come to learn by virtue of doing this job. But for many countries, the idea of working for the public service and of having it be the primary source of your loyalty and your devotion and your political and professional attention is a whole new idea. And that kind of loyalty and that kind of team spirit and willingness and ability to innovate is just a long-standing journey that countries need to go on. So to do this kind of work, we've tried to establish a whole series of different kinds of platforms for helping people to learn and do this kind of work. So yes, we have our own training program of sorts, but it's not done with individuals. You don't sign up to do this course as an individual, you sign up to do it as a team. And we have it offered for free through the internet from Harvard Kennedy School, and students or teams of people, one of whom has to be a government official, do this kind of work together as a team. And by virtue of having several hundred of these teams doing this work at any one time, we then are able to connect all those different teams so that they can learn from what other teams elsewhere are doing. Hopefully within their own ministry, within their own public sector space, they are also then working ways to find other like-minded people that are doing this kind of work elsewhere. And then connecting that even more broadly to a larger set of networks of people elsewhere around the world. We do some of that through this network we call Doing Development Differently. It's a particular team of largely of development professionals around the world who are committed to trying to find new and better ways of being able to truly build up the team capabilities of the different ministries that they work with around the world, and to really have a big focus on real-time feedback mechanisms to help these teams learn and get better at what they do. So the analogy with learning a musical instrument or learning a foreign language, or even learning your mother tongue for that matter, is apt, because it just took a long time for your little brain, my little brain, to figure all these things out. And if you persist, you get good at it. And part of the work now of these new approaches is trying to see this kind of work for the very complex work that it is, but not imagining that there are any quick fixes to doing all of that. The last part of all this, I think, is seeing this kind of work and this kind of effort as requiring a broader social movement. These kinds of conferences are ways in which you meet like-minded people who are all, by virtue of giving up a day or so to come to a conference like this, you have indicated or signaled your commitment to these kinds of issues, and trying to then connect you out to others like yourselves in other countries around the world who do this kind of work is an essential part of how you maintain motivation, how you get new ideas, how you feel hopeful and positive about the very difficult work that we are all involved in. Let me conclude just by being a little more circumspect then about the role of new technologies, because I think it's very easy to be impressed, even seduced by what we hear and see with regards to what new technology can do. And I'm no Luddite. I'm not unaware of the great things that can be done to make public sector more efficient by using some of these kinds of tools. But I think, as I said, and I will keep saying, the human, the component, the people part of it has always been, is now, and will continue to be the binding constraint that shapes how any particular organization works. And imagining that we can short circuit some of that just by making sure everybody has their own laptop, or make sure everyone's permanently connected to the internet, or that we have bigger and fancier data sets that can help us crunch out all this data. There might be certain kinds of problems for which that's exactly the right thing to do, but I think history would suggest that there's just lots of other things that accompany these new technologies that we need to be deeply conscious of right from the outset. All the challenges that are going on around Facebook and Twitter at the moment, for example, are all questions about what happens when this fancy new technology kind of becomes like fire. It's when it's in a candle or a nice little fire in your campsite or in your home, it's wonderful. When that fire escapes and it becomes an inferno, it can burn the whole thing down. And the essence of the internet, the essence of new technologies, as Geert says, is having humans be in control, not the other way around. And we haven't figured out how to do that yet. Just today, Twitter has announced that it will no longer be carrying political messages. That's a big step in some sense. But there are a whole bunch of other ways that the bad guys, as well as the good guys, can use all these same technologies to undermine what is often being, or trying to be done, in the name of public sector work. And being deeply conscious of that right from the outset, I think, helps us to be simultaneously embracing as necessary of what these new technologies can do, but also deeply aware that left unconstrained, these are like fire. It'll just burn the whole house down. And modern democracy, modern systems of accountability, the modern public sector itself is a beautiful thing. Doesn't look like it is to most people, but it is, because it underpins and makes possible the life of opportunity and prosperity and peace that we mostly enjoy most of the time. But it's created. It was something that humans invented, that our grandparents and parents assembled, and it's our job at this point in history to be the stewards of those systems and not ones that abandon that historical lesson and just because some new fancy type of technology comes along. At the end of the day, machines can't replace much of the distinctly human qualities that are necessary to run these things. Virtue, patience, kindness, courage. Those are all things that you care about when you go to see a doctor, when you've been perhaps needing to see the police, when you're having your day in court. All of those human components become so central to actually making the system function and have local legitimacy and to do what it's supposed to do. And imagining or thinking that we can have some technical fix for those kinds of problems, I think, is abandoning the central role that humans should play in trying to shape all of these different things. So at the end of the day, these things should be seen as complements to and not substitutes for these more mainstream challenges of trying to figure out how to do the difficult work of the public sector at scale for all. These are the challenges of the 21st century. It falls to us at this point in history to try and take those challenges to heart and to try and respond to them in ways that enjoy and exploit 21st century technology, but to be deeply conscious of what's happened in the past when these equivalent new technologies have come along and have disrupted things. And when disruption occurs, sometimes it's really good. It helps to create a new space, but sometimes, like fire, it burns the house down. And we have to be very conscious, I think, at this moment in time that it's still not clear which way that fire is going to go. But the task and the excitement and the challenge of public sector work in the 21st century is figuring out how all those different things all come together, and at the end of the day, so that we can pass on to our own children this sense of deep appreciation for the amazing things that humans can do when they work together. Thanks very much.